We are the national network of Lutheran Health and Human Services from across the country. We're a large community, over 300 organizations, founded sort of in that shared faith tradition of service and community. I'm really passionate about the role that the nonprofit sector plays in our society. And when I thought about taking my new position, I asked myself, what does the world look like without the nonprofit sector? What does the world look like without the faith-based nonprofit sector? And I was like, I don't like what that world looks like. You know, as a leader, I think it's really important for us in particular to kind of assess where we are and understand, okay, maybe this isn't where we want to be, but it's okay. And we're going to get to where we need to be.
Welcome to On Board with Transparent Leadership, an Easter Seals podcast. I am Kendra Davenport, President and CEO of Easter Seals, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Alesia Frerichs, President and CEO of Lutheran Services in America. Welcome, Alesia.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining me. Do me a favor, if you will, and just tell our listeners what Lutheran Services does, and then we'll move into how you joined them, because I know you've had a really interesting career, as most people who, end up in a leadership position have, but you've worked on the dark side for-profit and on the nonprofit side. But first, give our listeners an overview of what Lutheran Services does.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Lutheran Services in America, we are the national network of Lutheran Health and Human Services from across the country. We're a large community, over 300 organizations, founded sort of in that shared faith tradition of service and community. And some founded before the Civil War, others more recently. We have a large presence, 1,400 communities, 46 states, providing $26 billion of services every year, and really focused on what we call advancing health and opportunity for all. So health in the broadest sense of the word, mind, body, and spirit.
Well, thank you. That's super helpful. A lot of entities moving at once, right? Mm-hmm. So tricky for any leader. Talk to me a little bit about what drew you to this role, because I know you've been there a while, and prior to that you were a consultant for about a decade. Prior to that you were in the private sector. So talk a little bit about your journey into this leadership position you've held for a while now.
Right. Well, and you've mentioned the fact that I've had 3 careers, and I like to say I finally found my dream job.
That's great.
So, I started out in technology and then did consulting for several years. Actually, I had my own consulting practice for about 11, and it was consulting that brought me to Lutheran Services in America. I was intentional through my consulting practice to start developing my expertise in the nonprofit sector. And I had a focus on education and healthcare and the environment. And so ended up being a consultant for a while with Lutheran Services in America. And at one point, after a couple of years of asking me, the president and CEO, my predecessor, Charlotte Haberacker, asked me once again. And I remember where I was, and I was like, yes, I want to join. It was just, I actually felt very called. So I went home and told my husband that, I wanted to kind of change careers, and was he in? And he said yes. And so I haven't looked back. It's an amazing network of, a lot of our organizations are really large, complicated health and human service providers, sometimes the largest nonprofits in their state. So the people that I get to work with are really, they could be doing anything they want, and they've chosen to live lives of service and make the world a better place. And so I say, where else would I want to be?
I love that. I love that. And that really, I can relate to that. I've spent my entire career in nonprofit and have had a number of opportunities to go into the private sector and just really feel that my motivation comes from what you just described, helping other people, being called to a
Yeah.
higher purpose, and maybe even having your faith or your values
Right.
imbued in all you do on the day to day. I've always found as a mom, a working mom, that helps. That was always the
Right.
spackle that held everything together, right? So
Yeah.
talk to me if you can about what you perceive to be some of the biggest challenges facing nonprofit leaders today. And if you can relate that to your own experience and say, tell our audience what your biggest challenge is as a leader, as a manager of people right now, what that might be.
There are a lot of challenges facing the nonprofit sector. And I have to say that I am really passionate about the role that the nonprofit sector plays in our society. And when I thought about taking my new position, I asked myself, what does the world look like without the nonprofit sector? What does the world look like without the faith-based nonprofit sector? And I was like, I don't like what that world looks like. And I want to do what I can to strengthen it. We have increasing competition with the for-profit sector and private equity space, and in places you wouldn't imagine, foster care. And we know that when profit's a motive, there are different outcomes, right, as opposed to people. And so I think that the challenge with that is, I'm an economist by training, so I'm not afraid of competition. But I think the challenge becomes that to a certain extent, we get a unlevel playing field, right? That it's really hard to make the investments that we need to make, where it's hard to kind of develop that capital to be responsive to some of the really big changes in our society, like technology and AI and those kind of things, where there's just that advantage in the for-profit sector. So I think the increasing competition, the higher acuity, we as mission-based organizations, we don't just come into a community and stay as long as we can make a profit and then leave, right? We're there for the long haul. And so working with, there's a much higher level of acuity in communities, which requires a higher level of skill and care. Workforce is everybody's challenge. And I think that, if we talk about a challenge in the nonprofit sector, particularly the health and human service sector, what does human services look like when there are no humans to serve? And working through, how do we think about engaging, bringing more people into the workforce through alternative ways, looking at credentialing differently, and those kind of things. So I would definitely say that, those are some of the top. We're government funded by and large. And so that adds another layer of challenge as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think many of the things you just touched on, I've experienced. And one of the things I'd love you to tease out a little bit about it with you is the competition from the private sector. And I don't necessarily mean in terms of programs, right, that nonprofits are running, I mean more in terms of retaining staff, attracting staff. And I've always thought there was a real struggle in the nonprofit sector to acquire the best people, because typically we don't pay the same as our for-profit counterparts. I think that the scales are changing, right? And they're moving heavier in favor of working for a nonprofit because of the emphasis on quality of life, purpose, and meaning of jobs. And yet I still feel it's a little tricky. We still can't offer some of the benefits that for-profits can. Do you experience the same thing at Lutheran Services?
We see that particularly, and I just came back from a visit in Ohio yesterday, where I was with, like I said, we span the broad spectrum of human services. So I was with organization that does a lot of disability services, and then another organization that does a food pantry, and then another one that does affordable housing. And the general observation is that particularly at the entry level, and I don't know if it's this generation that kind of spurs through things, they get a lot of experience in the nonprofit sector, and then in the healthcare sector, then they go and they can work and earn.
Yeah, unfortunately,
so that's a bit
I think
of a
the
challenge.
Same.
Yeah,
I think we see the same thing in tech positions, having to do with data or
right,
maintenance of our website. It's tricky because, just as you said, this is a training ground. Nonprofits offer, I think, a very familiar, warm environment where the individual is often championed, and then they acquire those skills and leave. So one of the things I also think is inherent with that struggle is maintaining morale. Because you touched on that at the very top of this episode when you said, nonprofits are facing terrific challenges. A lot of them are financial. When you're constantly working with such tight margins, I think it can be a morale sapper, right? So how, as a leader, do you help improve your team's morale, maintain good morale? Is there any trick or tip you rely on that you think works well to achieve that balance, positive balance?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think, so there are challenges when we think about the workforce, but then I think of all the bright spots of the amazing people that, I have on my team and that I get to meet throughout all my travels. And, that sense of purpose and being part of something bigger than yourself, is a big calling and a common factor, that I really see across the network and across the organization. So I think that, the morale can come from really the purpose of the work to a certain extent. And to really, we have this expression that, who else? If we don't do it, who else will do this, right? And so it's really, I think that almost gives you some empowering that, we have to step into the gap where others can't or won't. You asked my question about what brought me to my work. Was I was actually involved in an organization that provided services for people with who hadn't learned to read by the time they were 24, so adult basic education. And if you look across our country and the way our government is structured, if you haven't learned to read by the time you're 24, there's no cost benefit that makes anybody say we should teach you to read. And yet there are organizations like the one that I was part of that we were committed that when that grandmother or that returning citizen decided now's the time that I want, to learn to read, it didn't matter. We were going to work with you on that. And I was the interim executive director for that organization for a while. And I remember when I was fundraising for it, I was like, oh my gosh, this population is so hard to fundraise for. And then I was like, but wait a minute, that's the point. That's my job, is to raise awareness, and that, if we don't do this, it won't get done. And so I think there's a way to kind of, you have to acknowledge the challenges, but I think there's also this incredible call to, to make the world a better place that can really motivate a workforce. I think those are important things.
Well said. And I couldn't agree more. I think that's one of my favorite parts of the nonprofit arena. And I feel very similarly, because when I go to our affiliates, it is not uncommon for me to ask staff, well, when did you come to this affiliate? How long have you been here? And the response is frequently 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 15 years ago. But the enthusiasm among the newer staff who have been there 18 months or 2 years is parallel. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It is the meaning and the purpose. And it's also, I think, hard to find, at least for me. And I've talked with many of my for-profit colleagues, and they agree. In your role now, I'm sure you're asked, by junior employees or people just coming into the workforce, how do they become a leader? How do they advance professionally? It's something I'm asked frequently. And I'll tell you what my answers are to that after I hear a little bit of what you would say to someone asking those questions.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And first of all, I think I reflect back on my own experience, and I had strong mentors. I had a mentor who also said, find strong female mentors, because I was in the tech sector. And I had opportunity, which is just sort of chance to a certain extent, right? And then I had excitement and passion about the work I was doing. So I think if you have those things, but, to me, really, being in a place that wants to see you grow and wants to mentor you is almost, in my experience, one of the really key ingredients, because it helps fuel your interest and your excitement. It develops your professionalism, and those kind of things. So we really strive at our organization to mentor, and to be curious. So that's another piece. Yeah, we don't have a big professional development budget, but we're right on Capitol Hill. So let's work together to sort of talk about, where do you want to grow? I had a mentor who said, always think about what you want to put in your toolkit for your next, where you want to be in your next position. And so we have those conversations and really nurture that professional development, I think, really, and letting people know they're in charge of it, but how can we work with you on that?
I think we at Easter Seals feel the same way. And I love that response, because I think while we don't have a formal mentoring program, we do encourage staff to join forces and to identify a buddy, if you will, someone on the team that can help mentor them. But we also encourage them to look for mentors in odd places, people they don't necessarily know. I find people are actually usually welcoming of the opportunity to mentor someone. And I think it makes a big difference. Your point about women is not lost. And I think the playing field is a little bit more level, but if you can identify a female mentor who's going to say, don't, water down your personality so you won't be branded as aggressive versus assertive, do everything you can to avoid the labels and the stereotypes and keep doing you. Seeing strong women, strong leaders like you in action, I think is the best way for younger women to learn. And I do think, I'm a big fan of Indra Nooyi, and I keep talking about her on these podcasts because I read her book and her most recent book, and I just see so many similarities. And some of her advice is just keep putting one foot in front of the other and doing you and not listening to all of that. Is there something that you were told by a mentor, some piece of advice that has stuck with you throughout your career and which you rely on?
Oh, that's another good question. I've got lots of advice throughout my journey. I think the other piece of advice that's really good is to keep things in perspective, right? And so, as a leader, I think it's really important for us in particular to kind of assess where we are and understand, okay, maybe this isn't where we want to be, but it's okay. And we're going to get to where we need to be, particularly when those unexpected, COVID is an example because, we had to sort of stand up processes and be calm and react and make everyone feel comfortable. But that happens, there's a lot of times where when things, a big project you were expecting to get doesn't get landed, or, something like that. So I think it's really important to, just help kind of keep that perspective and help everyone, we have an expression, well, no one's died, so let's move forward. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, okay, this isn't the worst that could happen.
I know exactly what you mean. And, but way back when, maybe 20, 30 years ago, early in my career, one of my good friends' sisters worked for the Campbell Soup Company in sales. And her expression was, we're just making soup here, folks. In other words, nobody's dying, or it's just soup. And that always kind of rings in my ears. But that leads me, that was a nice segue. Thank you for teeing this next question up for me. It leads me to ask you how you stay buoyant. I think sometimes, and I'm speaking right now, thinking of all the plates I'm juggling today and have been this week, last week, going into the next week. It can be very difficult, I think, to maintain your balance and feel full and not depleted or mentally tired. And I'll give you an example. Last night I was spent. I had been in Philly. I drove home to Virginia. I was packing. We have painters throughout our house, and my husband really didn't want me to come home. He kept saying, don't you need to be in Chicago? Like, do you really want to come home to the house? So it was just, as my mom used to say, all hell's a poppin' at the house. And we we went out to dinner, calmed things down. I packed, and then I had a few minutes and I had the laptop out. I was working and I closed the laptop and I said, okay, I'm done for tonight. And he looked at me and he said, could we now just go run through these things? And I thought, oh my gosh, no, we can't. I'm going to, lose it here. I can't teach one more thing. And I must have said it, Alesia, 3 times to him. And he's such a good sport. I said, no, I don't think so tonight. No, I really don't want to talk about this. And then finally I was like, I have nothing left. There is nothing in the tank. Let's pick this conversation up tomorrow or preferably, on the weekend. But I think realizing, where you are, that you need to fill your cup again. And I love that expression. How do you do that? Because I have a couple things I do. I have more than a couple. I have a lot of things I do to replenish my fortitude, my patience, my enthusiasm. Are there things that you do that you can share with our audience that keep you buoyant, keep you on an even keel, and help you manage the million things?
So I actually think the first thing is to be vigilant about staying buoyant, right? Knowing the warning signs, because it's actually not necessarily about volume. It's not just like looking at my calendar and saying, well, I need to block off an hour a day. There's many things that can kind of trigger that. And sometimes activity increases my buoyancy. So I think for me, it's being very self-aware of you can start to feel the fatigue, right? I think is, at least for me, I can start to feel the fatigue. And then I have to ask myself, okay, how am I going to take a step back? I have some very simple things. I'm a major morning person, so I always really try and be done with my work by 6. Like if I look at my laptop after 6, I'm up at 4:30, so I get my time in. But if I look at it after 6, it kind of ruins my evening. But I think, and then, obviously I love to run. I hike. I go for a walk every day. So the self-care is important to me. But even if you're doing that every day, I actually do meditate, because that's actually what helps me. Is I can tell, sometimes you just get to that intensity level inside where you're like, okay, and this is more than what 8 hours of sleep or a run is going to do, and just being really intentional. But for me, it's that intentional journey of channeling my energy, because I'm energetic. And so sometimes buoyancy can become too much intensity. And so it's kind of like,
again, I can relate. And I think many leaders are that way. I think we tend to start our days early to maximize the day. And I've spoken with a number of people, just like yourself, who say, I get up at 4:30 or 5. And I resemble that remark as well. But like you, by the end of the day, there's a limit. I'd say because of the time difference, for me, it's more like 7 o'clock, but I don't even feel I'm bringing my best self to conversations or emails at that point. Yeah. So if it's rote, if it's things I just have to do by rote, okay, I'll do it. But I think carving out that time is important. Is there something that you utilize, a template or a trick or a tip you can share with our listeners about how you make the most or maximize your day? Is there something, in other words, that you do work-wise, some tool you use to make your day more organized, or make your actions more effective, to record them, anything at all?
Yeah, so I try and divide my day into 3 things. So I have the list, right? And I'm sure people do this too. And it's kind of like, and then if the list is too long for it to get done, then I call the list. But I really like what's short term that I've got to get done today. But if it's more than 3 hours, then the list is too long. And I've either got to get it off my desk or move it to another day. So because we're involved in a strategic plan like everybody, and you can get really consumed by the day to day. And I think that's a big danger sign. So that is really, and then a large chunk of our work is, obviously I'm sure you're the same too, is kind of relationship development, and really kind of who are those key partners and what does that cultivation look like? And then I do have reading time. I really try and set aside. I'm actually energized by reading when I can read things and sort of gets me thinking in different ways, and really making sure that I have time for that as well. So I actually intentionally look at my calendar. Some days I'm better at it than others, but that's kind of how I start my day, which I think a lot of people do. And then I sometimes do at the end of the day and say, okay, what went wrong? and what am I not going to do tomorrow? So those are, time management, I think is.
Yeah. I think we struggle. I think we all struggle with that. And I love your analogy and description of how you break your day into 3 parts. I think that's interesting. I haven't heard that, and I might try that. You also touched on reading. I usually do this later in the each episode, but since you went there, I'd love to know, because I'm a voracious reader. I read a lot. I read everything. I read everything from work related stuff to a lot of biographies to political stuff. I read the New York Times every day. Maybe not all at once, but throughout the day, I catch this, that, and the other thing. Is there a particular book you've read recently or are reading that you could recommend to anyone in the professional world, professional book? Or if not, is there fiction you're reading that you really like that you recommend?
Okay, so I'm like you too. I've always got several books by my bed. I've got the audio book. I love to read. And I do read the paper as well. So I read, when I came onto my job, 2 books that I know everyone has read, but I highly recommend was The First 90 Days, really good. And I give it to all my senior leaders because it is a very good book to just sort of remind you, don't come in and think you know all the answers, and how to approach sort of assessing the position. And so I thought that was, that's an older, well-known book. But when I came into my new position, I reread it and I was like, oh yeah. And so now 2/3 of my team is new, my leadership team, since I came on board, and have recommended that book to everyone. CEO Excellence by, I think it's Carolyn Dwyer. Have you read that one?
Yes.
That is good. And then, one of the books that really just changed my life, not changed my life, but I found so powerful, was The Sum of Us by, it's SUM. Yeah. So that was one that I had recently read. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book, but those were.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
I haven't read it. Highly recommend it. And if you're into audiobooks, she reads it. I'll find out her name. She has a beautiful voice. It's a powerful book.
I'm writing this down as we talk. But as I said, if and I do audio too, because I just sometimes get frustrated with reading or I'm on a plane or whatever, the lighting is dim. So My Life in Full is Indra Nooyi's book. If you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it. I love it. Good. Well, listen to it. I listen to it, and hearing her talk, hearing her laugh, I just find her so interesting. The other book that I read a few years ago, and which really has influenced the way I manage and the way I help teams attack projects, is Atomic Habits by James Clear. And it's really about the aggregation of marginal gains. In other words, that's a fancy way of saying baby steps add up to big steps over time. And his analogies throughout the book are tremendous. I've read it and I've listened to it, and I highly recommend listening to it. So those are 2 things.
Okay, well, thank you.
2 things. All right. Last question for you is, what is something about you we can't Google? What's something that defines who you are that the general public, that you can share, that you want to share, that we can't find out by?
That is a good question. Well, my husband and I just love to hike. So we are big hikers, and we have an affinity for hiking in Europe because it's so daggone civilized, because they have little, it's easy to get to the national parks, and they've got little restaurants on the top of the mountains. And so we spend a lot of our time hiking and getting out. It's another way to restore.
So nice. So nice. Yeah. I spent a lot of time on the continent of Africa, throughout Africa, in a previous role. And I can remember visiting South Africa with one of my team members, and they were taking me on a tour, and we were in a car, and we were going around the edge of the coastline, and we were very high up, and there was no guardrail. And I just said out loud, I wasn't even thinking, I said, I just find everywhere other than the United States is not as safety conscious as we are. And the whole car burst out laughing. And they were like, okay, how old are you, Kendra? And I said, well, there's no guardrail. There's nothing here. So when you said it's civilized and hiking, I thought, okay, yeah, it is. It's different. It's definitely different. But no, I love being outside too. And sure, you've hiked out by me because we live in the same area. I live out in Northern Virginia, out at the end of 267, so way out in Percival, and we have great hiking around us.
Old Rag.
Great, yes, great dirt roads. Yeah, so terrific. So before we leave, is there anything you want to share about Lutheran Services in America? Anything you want to be sure people know before we conclude?
Yeah, I think, we are, like I said, such strong partners in over 1,400 communities across the country, working with people from all walks of life. And I think just really, and working with large number of community partners and just, when I go places, people always say, oh, I love the Lutherans. I just didn't realize there were more of them. Right. And so I think what's great is I want people to, to look for a Lutheran, a Lutheran organization. We're in so many different communities and in such strong partners with healthcare and, our city and state providers and just, working to make the world a better place and advance health and opportunity for all would really, so think one of our organizations if you get the chance.
Absolutely. And where can they go to learn more about Lutheran Services?
Right. We are at www.lutheranservices.org.
Terrific. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you, Alesia, for making the time and for being so candid with your responses.
Kendra, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Now on to Ask Me Anything. So what do you do if you're a leader experiencing burnout? This is a great question. And I just talked a lot with Alesia about this because I think leadership is inherently prone to burnout. Leaders, that is, are inherently prone to burnout if they take their role seriously and they work hard. I was thinking about that today because I just have an awful lot on my plate most days, but I absolutely do today and yesterday. And so I shut down my laptop late last night. I got up early this morning, went to the airport, opened the laptop again, worked on it until I got on the plane, worked on something some more, got to Chicago, opened the laptop again. It just continues. And I think at a certain point in the day, if you're not careful, that builds up. And you never want to become so tired because of your own schedule and your workload that you become frustrated or burned out or you can't bring your best self. So you need to replenish. You need to be aware of that fatigue. As our last guest, Alesia Frerichs said, you need to be aware of that fatigue. And to combat it, I think there are really simple things. You can meditate for 15 minutes. You can take a walk. You can get something to eat. You can switch off and read a book, listen to something. Do something different. Maybe it's just taking an hour out of your day to paint or to bake or to cook or to shop, to do something you enjoy, to exercise, to listen to a podcast, to just sleep or just sit in silence. I don't think there's enough silence in our life, and it can be very cathartic. When I'm home, one of the things I do when I really just want to come down and get centered is take a bath. I think water is very cathartic. In the summer, I jump in the pool. I spend time with our animals. Animals are also terrifically cathartic. And study after study proves that people who live with animals, for whom animals are a part of their life, are much more grounded. They're happier. They live longer. And they combat the early stages of dementia just by having that relationship. Check in with your kids. I mean, there's just so many things, and I think they're unique to all of us, but I think exercising those things, exercising those parts of your mind in the midst of the barely controlled chaos is what helps you sustain. It's what helps you keep going in the face of, an awful lot of work or continuous challenges. The other thing, and I think we don't talk enough about this, is learning. Learning can be very empowering, and it can help fight fatigue because you can learn. And that's one of the things I love about this podcast, is having the ability to get inside the minds of leaders and ask them what they do to become more efficient, what they do to organize their day, how they stay buoyant, as we're talking about right now, and the tricks and tips and tools they use to declutter and to focus, but also to stay engaged and to reduce burnout. And I think they're unique to everyone, but they're also similar, right? And I think the similarity, or the running theme, is noticing, is being vigilant, and staying aware that you need to push back from the desk and engage your mind in a different way. So I think that's it. Easter Seals empowers people with disabilities and their families to be full and equal participants in their communities and within society. Easter Seals is where everyone can feel welcomed and people know that they aren't judged, but treated with the dignity that they deserve. Each day, we provide life-changing services nationwide and advocate for policies that improve quality of life. From employment to housing services to job training, childcare and respite care, adult day programs, and so much more, Easter Seals is making a profound impact in thousands of communities every day. You can learn more by visiting easterseals.com. That concludes our episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, be sure to write a review, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to join us in the next episode as we discuss how we can all get on board with transparent leadership.